Hey everyone, welcome to Chatbox. I'm Bryce.
And I'm Hannah.
We're so glad you're tuning in today.
Do we have an interesting conversation to share with you guys and gals tonight? Episode 6 deep dives into a great YouTube channel called Only Human. The topic Eating with the Enemy. A drag queen and Catholic priest discuss marriage.
I'm ready to discuss. It was an interesting sit down from two different sides with other groups as well. But this was, I guess, was the center of focus.
So hopefully we have let go of all those leftover Thanksgiving dinners and we're ready to move on to a nightcap and something sweet.
Or salty.
Let's get started.
All right, welcome in everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely. Always ready to get into it.
Awesome. Well, you know me, always got to find the most interesting stuff to dig into.
You always deliver.
Well, let's hope so, right? Today, we're looking at this project, this experiment called Eating with the Enemy.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
It's wild, right? I mean, the whole premise is just fascinating to me. So basically, they take people with like completely opposite viewpoints.
Right, polar opposites.
Exactly. And they sit them down for dinner together. Like, can you imagine?
It's kind of a recipe for disaster or maybe like a breakthrough. Who knows?
That's the whole point of the deep dive. See if anyone actually manages to connect, you know?
Well, I'm definitely curious to see how this plays out.
Okay, so the pairings, I mean, they did not hold back. We've got a Catholic priest, Father Joe, having dinner with Bonnie, who's a drag queen.
Wow, okay, starting strong.
Oh, it gets better. We've got a libertarian, Adam, breaking bread with Mattress Mick, you know, the homeless advocate.
Oh, yeah, I know who you mean.
And then there's Luke, a member of the Irish Freedom Party, sitting down with Bashir, a law lecturer.
Oh, that's going to be interesting.
Right. Like, just thinking about these conversations is already making my head spin.
Well, I'm all ears. Let's get into it.
Okay, so first up, Father Joe and Bonnie.
Okay, the priest and the drag queen.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a clash of cultures, right?
You can already see the tension just from the initial reactions.
Oh, absolutely. Bonnie's like taken aback, you know, surprised. Father Joe, he seems a little apprehensive, but they both seem willing to at least try.
It's almost like they're both stepping into the unknown.
Exactly. And that sense of the unknown, it really ramps up when they start talking about marriage equality.
Ah, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And Father Joe, he kind of walks this tightrope, you know?
Yeah.
He says, love, it can definitely exist between same-sex couples. He acknowledges that. But he also emphasizes the church's stance, you know, marriages between a man and a woman, that whole thing.
Right, so he's trying to reconcile his own personal views with the doctrine of the church.
It seems that way, yeah. And he does say he's open to civil unions. But he makes this distinction, right? Civil unions are one thing, marriage is another.
That's interesting. It's like he's trying to find a compromise, but is it enough?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because Bonnie, she doesn't hold back. She brings up, you know, the influence of organized religion, the wealth, all of that. And she contrasts it with, you know, the teachings of Jesus, like helping the poor, that kind of thing.
That's pretty bold, especially when you're sitting across from a priest.
Yeah, I was like, whoa, where is this going? But here's the thing, Father Joe, he doesn't get defensive.
Really? How does he react?
He actually agrees with her, at least to some extent. He acknowledges that, yeah, organized religion has kind of become more about power than service in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that.
Me neither. And it's at that point that they kind of find this common ground, surprisingly. They start talking about humanism, compassion, you know, shared values.
So even though they have these very different viewpoints, they can still connect on a human level.
Exactly. And it's like, it reminds you that even when people seem worlds apart on certain issues, there can be these underlying connections, you know?
Absolutely. It's like peeling back the layers and finding that shared humanity.
Yeah. And then Bonnie tells this hilarious story about her granny. Like, her granny used to cover the TV whenever a same-sex couple kissed on screen.
Oh, wow. Very traditional.
But drag queens, totally fine.
That's so funny. It's like these little contradictions in how society evolves, right?
Yeah, like some things change, but some biases, they just stick around.
It makes you wonder, what biases are we holding on to without even realizing it?
Right. And then Father Joe, he leaves us with this really thought-provoking idea. He says he often finds God in unexpected places.
That's deep.
It is, right. It makes you think, like, where do we encounter the unexpected in our own lives? And are we open to those experiences? Or are we kind of closed off to anything that challenges our worldview?
I like that. It's a good challenge for all of us.
Okay, let's move on to our next dynamic duo, Luke and Bashir.
Okay, the Irish Freedom Party member and the law lecturer.
Yeah, and right from the start, you can feel this tension, especially from Bashir's perspective, as a black man.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He's understandably anxious about meeting someone whose political affiliations, well, that might suggest opposing views, right?
Absolutely. It's like walking into a situation where you're already on edge.
And then Luke, he asks Bashir that question, the one that's loaded.
Let me guess, where are you really from?
Bingo. And you can just see Bashir's frustration. He explains that, yeah, it might seem harmless to some people, but for people of color, that question, it carries this weight,
The weight of microaggressions constantly being othered.
Exactly, like you're not really seen as belonging.
It's a reminder that even seemingly innocent questions can be loaded with meaning.
Yeah, words matter, how we frame things. It can either build bridges or create walls,
Absolutely. And it sounds like this conversation is already starting to build some walls.
Well, it gets even more tense when they start talking about Trump and immigration. Luke, he focuses on the economic arguments, talking about how, minority unemployment rates are really low under Trump.
That's a common argument from that side of the political spectrum.
It is, and he argues that illegal immigration, it hurts people in lower wage brackets, that whole thing.
Right, the idea that immigrants are taking jobs away from native-born workers.
But Bashir, he challenges that framing.
How so?
He points out that the term illegal immigration, it's loaded, it dehumanizes people. And he brings up the historical context, how countries like the U.S. and the U.K., they've historically welcomed immigrants during good economic times. But then when things get tough, they turn against them.
It's a pattern we see over and over again. Immigrants become the scapegoat.
And it's interesting how Luke keeps connecting low-skilled jobs with immigrants. Like that's the only kind of work they're capable of doing.
It's a very limited view, and it kind of ignores the contributions that immigrants make across all sectors of society.
Right. And Bashir ends this part of the conversation with a really interesting observation. He says he rarely encounters such open opposition to immigration.
What do you think he means by that?
I think it raises a question about the bubbles we live in, Are we surrounding ourselves with people who only agree with us? Are we even exposed to different viewpoints anymore?
That's a really good question, and I think it's something we all need to ask ourselves.
Okay, ready for a complete change of pace.
Hit me with it.
All right, we've got Becca and Michael, who, get this, describes himself as an alpha male.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Oh, you're going to love this. His entrance is something else. Flamboyant, driven, and a self-proclaimed fan of Ted Bundy.
Wait, Ted Bundy?
Of all people I know. It's like, what?
That's definitely unexpected.
The thing.
Yeah.
But they both agree to participate.
Yeah.
And their conversation about beauty pageants, it's actually pretty insightful.
Beauty pageants, how did that even come up?
Right. But Becca, she critiques the focus on looks, obviously. But Michael, he actually emphasizes the personality development aspect.
That's interesting. It challenges the stereotype that beauty pageants are all about superficiality.
Yeah, like you can't judge a book by its cover, right?
Exactly. And I guess Michael is a good example of that.
He is. But then, get this, he casually mentions that he cheated on past girlfriends.
Oh, wow. That took a turn.
But he tries to justify it by saying he was always honest with them afterward. Like, that makes it okay.
That's a tough one. Can honesty really make up for a betrayal like that?
It's a question that really makes you think, right?
Definitely. It's about more than just words. It's about actions and consequences.
Okay, one more pairing before we wrap up this part of the deep dive.
Lay it on me.
All right, we've got Adam, our young libertarian, and Mattress Mick, the homeless advocate.
That's quite a pair.
You think. Talk about opposite ends of the spectrum, right?
Absolutely. I can't even imagine how that conversation would go.
Well, their debate about housing, it really highlights those differences. Adam, being a libertarian, he's all about private solutions, low taxes, individual choice.
Right. The government should stay out of it, let the free market do its thing.
Exactly. But Mattress Mick, he has a very different view. He believes everyone has a right to housing, and he sees it as the government's responsibility to ensure that right.
So it's a fundamental disagreement about the role of government in society.
It really is. And they go back and forth, private solutions versus government intervention.
It's a debate that's been going on forever.
Yeah, and there's this moment where Mattress Mick tells Adam, you live in a different real world.
Oof, that's gotta sting.
Right. It's like he's saying that Adam's theoretical ideas don't account for the actual struggles that people face.
It highlights that gap between theory and reality. Yeah.
It does, and it makes you think about whose real world gets prioritized in these debates.
That's a great point. Whose voices are we listening to? And whose voices are we ignoring?
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our deep dive into eating with the enemy. We've seen sparks fly, we've seen surprising moments of connection, and we've been challenged to think about our own beliefs and biases,
It's definitely been a wild ride so far.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue exploring these conversations and uncover even more insights.
Looking forward to it.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into eating with the enemy.
Back for more.
We've seen some pretty intense moments so far, right?
Yeah, some real clashes of perspective.
But also some surprisingly human moments too,
Those are the ones that stick with you.
They really do, and I think as we continue exploring these conversations, we'll see even more of that, those moments where even though people disagree, they still manage to connect.
Well, I'm ready to dive back in.
Okay, let's pick up where we left off with Father Joe and Bonnie. We were talking about Father Joe's idea that he often finds God in unexpected places.
Right, that really stuck with me.
Well, the conversation takes this interesting turn when they start talking about what religion actually means to them. And Bonnie, she drops this little truth bomb. She says, I have a problem with the word religion.
I can see that.
She prefers terms like faith or spirituality.
It's like religion has all this baggage, right?
Exactly. It feels institutional, all about rules and dogma. Whereas faith, it's more personal, more about an individual's connection to something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, it's less about the structure and more about the feeling.
And Bonnie, she goes on to critique organized religion, particularly, its tendency to dictate morality.
Oh, yeah, that's a common criticism.
And she brings up the whole thing with Jesus overturning the tables in the temple,
Right, suggesting that maybe the church has strayed from its original values.
It's a pretty bold statement, especially considering she's, having dinner with a priest.
That takes some guts.
But what's amazing is that Father Joe, he doesn't get defensive at all.
Really? So how does he respond?
He actually agrees with her, at least to some extent. He acknowledges that organized religion has, in a lot of ways, become more about power than about serving humanity.
Wow, that's surprising, but also kind of refreshing,
It is, and then they have this beautiful moment where they both find common ground in humanism. They talk about recognizing that shared humanity, that connection that goes beyond our beliefs.
It's a reminder that we're all human at the end of the day.
And I was really surprised when Father Joe actually described himself as a humanist.
A humanist priest. That's interesting.
It really challenges the idea that you can't be both religious and humanistic.
It's like those labels. They don't always capture the full complexity of a person, right?
Okay, let's go back to Luke and Bashir. Their conversation takes this unexpected turn when they're asked about the role of love and affection in their lives.
Okay, where is this going?
Well, Luke reveals that he's never been in a relationship.
That's interesting.
And Bashir, he's kind of surprised by that,
Yeah. I mean, it's not something you necessarily expect to hear from someone in their, late 20s, early 30s?
Yeah, and being Bashir, he jumps right in and asks Luke if he thinks there's a link between his single status and his right-wing ideology.
Whoa, bold question.
It is. But Luke, to his credit, he doesn't shut down the conversation. He seems a little taken aback, but he's willing to engage.
Maybe a little uncomfortable, but he's rolling with it.
And then Bashir shares his own experience, how being in a loving relationship with a hardcore feminist actually challenged and expanded his own views.
That's fascinating. It's like love can be this force for growth and change.
He suggests that love and connection can have this transformative impact on our beliefs.
Makes you wonder how many of our strongly held beliefs are shaped by our personal experiences,
Yeah, both the positive and the negative.
Absolutely. Our relationships can really shape how we see the world.
The next question thrown their way is pretty interesting. They're asked, what law would you create or abandon if you were in charge?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Bashir, he says without hesitation, he'd implement hate speech laws.
That makes sense given his focus on social justice and equality.
But Luke's answer, it's the one that really stirs things up. He says he'd get rid of illegal immigration.
And that's where their different frameworks really clash, right?
Exactly. They end up having this heated debate about how we even define immigration and the words we use to talk about it.
Language matters. It shapes our perceptions.
Bashir takes issue with the term illegal immigration, saying it's dehumanizing.
Right. It's like you're reducing a person to their legal status.
And then there's this other revealing moment where Luke argues that Black and Hispanic unemployment rates were so low under Trump because of the reduction in immigration.
The classic argument that immigrants are taking jobs away from native-born workers.
But Bashir points out that it's not that simple.
It's way more complex than that. Immigration has all sorts of economic implications.
And he brings up another interesting point. He talks about how countries that have historically relied on immigration, like the U.S. and the U.K., they often embrace immigrants during economic booms, but then when things get tough, they turn against them.
It's like a cycle of exploitation almost.
Yeah, like, we need you now, but don't get too comfortable.
It's a pretty bleak perspective.
Okay, let's shift gears and check in with Becca and Michael. They're asked this question: do you believe life is harder as a man or a woman?
That's a loaded question.
And Michael, in true alpha male fashion, immediately says it's harder for women.
I bet he does.
But his reasoning is, well, let's just say it's unique. He says women bleed every month, while men only bleed when they're injured, so obviously women have it tougher.
Oh my God.
It's definitely a moment that makes you go, huh.
A very simplistic view of things, to say the least.
And then he doubles down and says men love with their physical bodies, while women love with their mental abilities, which is why women have a harder time letting go after a breakup.
Oh, wow. He's really leaning into those gender stereotypes.
It's like, where is he even getting this stuff from?
It's a reminder that even in seemingly casual conversations, these deeply ingrained beliefs about gender can surface.
Now, Adam and Mattress Mick get hit with a question that really gets to the heart of their ideological differences.
Yeah.
Do you trust the government?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Mattress Mick answers with a resounding yes. He emphasizes the government's role in providing essential services. Healthcare, housing, all of that.
Makes sense, given his work as a homeless advocate.
But Adam, the libertarian, he firmly disagrees.
Classic libertarian stance: the government is the problem, not the solution.
He believes that private individuals and organizations are better equipped to handle things like healthcare and housing.
The free market will take care of it all. That's the idea.
But Mattress Mick, he's not buying it. He argues that relying solely on private solutions would leave the most vulnerable people behind.
He's advocating for a system that prioritizes the collective good, not just individual gain.
And there's this telling moment where Mattress Mick tells Adam, you're living in a different real world.
Yeah, that line really stood out to me too.
It highlights that disconnect between theory and lived experience.
It's like Adam's worldview is based on these abstract ideas, but Mattress Mick is dealing with the harsh realities on the ground.
Now, they're all asked this question: is there anything in your life you feel guilty or ashamed about?
Wow, that's getting personal.
And Michael, the self-proclaimed alpha male, he drops this bombshell. He admits to cheating on past girlfriends.
Did not see that coming.
But then he tries to justify it by saying he always told them afterward.
Like, that somehow makes it okay.
Becca is understandably taken aback.
Betrayal is betrayal. Honesty doesn't erase the hurt.
It's a reminder that actions have consequences, even if you try to sugarcoat them with words.
And trust, once broken, is really hard to rebuild.
The next question takes them in a completely different direction. They're asked about the most historic event they've witnessed in their lifetimes.
Okay, broadening the scope a bit.
In Mattress Mick, he shares this really poignant story about the Chernobyl disaster. He acknowledges the tragedy, of course, but he also highlights the positive impact it had on his own life.
Really? How so?
He and his wife, they took in Russian children who were affected by the disaster.
That's amazing, turning tragedy into an opportunity for compassion.
He talks about the experience with so much warmth and gratitude.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there can be these glimmers of hope.
But Adam, he seems to struggle to come up with a defining historical event. He seems more focused on his own personal experiences.
It's like he's not as connected to the broader historical context.
Maybe it's a generational thing, or maybe it's just his personality.
It makes you think about how our own experiences shape the way we view history.
Okay, let's go back to Father Joe and Bonnie as they tackle their final question. What do you think of your conversation partner?
Time for some honest reflections.
Bonnie expresses her gratitude for the experience. She says Father Joe challenged her assumptions about Catholic priests. She talks about his kindness, his thoughtfulness, his broad understanding of the world.
It's like she's seeing him as a person, not just a representative of the church.
And Father Joe, he reciprocates those sentiments, describing Bonnie as a lovely, very engaging person.
So they both came away with a more nuanced view of each other.
And Father Joe, he even jokes that he'll be asking, where did I encounter God today? During his evening prayers.
That's great. It's like he's acknowledging that spirituality can be found in the most unexpected places.
We've witnessed some truly powerful conversations in this part of our deep dive. We've seen vulnerability lead to connection. We've seen different viewpoints clash and sometimes find common ground. And we've been challenged to examine our own beliefs and biases.
A lot to unpack there.
Stay tuned for the final part, where we'll wrap up our exploration of eating with the enemy. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into eating with the enemy.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, hasn't it? So many different perspectives, so many thought-provoking moments. I'm curious to hear your overall takeaways.
Well, I think what struck me the most is the power of simply having the conversation, even when it's difficult. Like, just the act of sitting down with someone who sees the world differently than you do. That in itself can be transformative.
Yeah, it's like even if you don't change each other's minds, you at least gain a better understanding of where the other person is coming from.
And that understanding, it can be a starting point for building bridges.
Okay, so let's jump back in with Becca and Michael. They're tackling a question that's always a hot topic: private education, good or bad?
Ah, yeah, that's a big one.
And Michael, true to form, he's all for private education, thinks it provides a better learning experience overall.
Not surprising given his emphasis on individual achievement and competition.
But Becca, she brings up a crucial point of affordability, or rather the lack thereof. Not everyone can afford private education, so it creates this system where access to quality education is determined by your wealth.
Right, it perpetuates existing inequalities.
And then they get into this discussion about the role of government in education. Adam, he thinks the government should just step back entirely. Let individuals set up their own schools, create a more competitive marketplace for education.
A very libertarian approach, less government, more individual choice.
But Mattress Mick, he's having none of it. He believes public schools are essential to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, has access to quality education.
It's a fundamental disagreement about the role of government in society, really.
Like, do we prioritize individual freedom or collective responsibility?
And whose real world gets to define those priorities?
It's a question that goes way beyond just education. It touches on so many aspects of our society.
Yeah.
And as Adam and Mattress Mick wrap up their conversation, you can tell they're not going to agree on everything. But there's this sense of, mutual respect. Like, they recognize that even with their disagreements, they were able to have a civil conversation.
It's a reminder that we can disagree without demonizing each other.
And that brings me to what I think is the biggest takeaway from eating with the enemy. It's not about convincing anyone to change their mind. It's about creating space for genuine human connection, even in this disagreement. It's about recognizing that the enemy is often not some monster, but just another person with their own experiences and perspectives.
And in today's world, where it's so easy to get caught up in our own echo chambers, that willingness to engage with those who hold different views, it's more important than ever.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you, our listeners, a question. Has your opinion on any of these issues shifted, even a little bit? Or maybe, even more importantly, has your willingness to listen to opposing viewpoints changed?
Because at the end of the day, understanding doesn't always require agreement. Sometimes the most transformative encounters happen when we simply open ourselves to the possibility of seeing the world through someone else's eyes.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into eating with the enemy. Until next time.
Until then, keep it real, keep it fun, and always keep it in the box.